Hi, this is Charles Jacobs. Welcome to my program, Paradigm Shift, where we'll be exploring what seems to be a new time for the Jewish people. An era filled with interesting and, yes, new possibilities, a Saudi-Israeli alliance, a Sunni-Judaic accommodation, the recognition of Jerusalem as Israel's capital, but also a period which is defined by a rising, new, and frightening form of anti-Semitism. Our focus today is on anti-Semitism on the college campus. And we're going to look at an historic moment near the very beginning of the campus wars. My guest today is Rachel Leah Fish, a person of whom it can be said emerged as the first public voice of Jewish resistance to this ideological assault on our people in America's campuses. Please look at this picture. It's June 2003, her graduation day. Rachel, a graduate student at Harvard's Divinity School, approached her dean to receive her diploma, and like all the graduates before her, one supposed she would naturally shake his hand. But there was no handshake. Instead, there is a righteous glare. For this young Jewish woman had publicly defeated the man who unhappily would hand her her scroll. Single-handedly, Rachel Fish had overpowered Harvard's bureaucracy and publicly humbled this country's preeminent educational institution. Rachel Leah Fish, a young woman from Johnson City, Tennessee, had forced Harvard to return a $2.5 million gift from an anti-Semitic think tank in the Arabian Gulf called the Zayed Center for Coordination and Follow-up. We're here today to share with you this historic tale and introduce to a national Jewish audience a modern-day Jewish warrior who many have called a heroine. Today, Rachel Fish is the Associate Director of the Schusterman Center for Israel Studies at Brandeis University. She's a lecturer at the Hornstein Jewish Professional Leadership Program and the Near Eastern and Judaic Studies, also at Brandeis. Rachel has a doctoral degree from Brandeis. Her dissertation examines the history of the idea of binationalism and other alternative visions for constructing the State of Israel. She's currently writing a book on the topic. Rachel has worked as an educator and consultant in various capacities in the Jewish community and higher education, teaching about Zionism and Israeli history at Brandeis, UMass Amherst, and in several prominent Jewish community programs. In 2015, she held the Rohr Visiting Professorship at Harvard University, where she lectured on modern Israel and received the Derek Bach Certificate of Teaching Excellence. Rachel is co-editor with Professor Ilan Troen of the forthcoming book, Essential Israel: Essays in the 21st Century. Because of her activism, Rachel landed on the Forward 50, which is a list of 50 most influential Jews in America in the years of 2003 and 2004. Rachel, welcome to Paradigm Shift.
Thank you, Charles.
So, what's with the glare? What happened? Why did you do that?
So I was a graduate student at Harvard Divinity School, and my first day of orientation was September 11th, 2001. And on September 11, 2001, as you recall, most of the students really didn't understand what was happening. We didn't have a lot of information coming to us. However, as we were all gathered in the auditorium to welcome us to the Divinity School, a place in which the university teaches future leaders in religion, religious leadership, as well as future academicians who want to study that subject, the dean of the Divinity School, Dean Graham, walked into the auditorium and said, "We don't know much, but what we can assume is that what has happened today on American soil is because of the United States' involvement and support with Israel." When he said that, I did exactly what you did. I was shocked. As you said, I'm from Johnson City, Tennessee. In some of those places, I expect to hear things like this, but not at a place like Harvard. And I couldn't imagine that the people sitting in the room, who are coming from literally all over the world, every possible religious denominational background, every ethnicity, could understand what he was saying. And it made an impression on me about this particular individual, that he had a particular agenda. It didn't take too much longer, a few months out, that I learned that Harvard Divinity School was not really engaged in the conversation about rising anti-Semitism in the Arab world. And I thought that Harvard should be a leading place for that conversation. And so I invited a handful of faculty members, both from the Divinity School, Harvard University at large, and I also invited activists within the Jewish communal world. You were one of those individuals. And when individuals presented about the rise of anti-Semitism, what I heard was that Harvard accepted funds from an anti-Semitic source and that not much had been done about it. I looked around the room after those remarks were made. There were about 60 to 75 students in the audience, and most people were just staring blankly, didn't really respond to the comment. And I remember I sat up and I wanted to know more. So I began doing research. I began trying to understand who accepted the money, how the money was given, for what purpose, and I basically began a campaign to uncover this information and to expose it to the university administration.
So you did research. You heard in the lecture that Harvard had accepted $2.5 million from an anti-Semitic source. No one blinked an eye, and you stood up and said to yourself, wait a minute, something has to stop here. So why'd you do that?
I think why I did that is because of the values that my parents bestowed upon us and gave us in an educational manner at home. You know, when you are a part of a very small Jewish community in the Smoky Mountains, you really have to have a sense of who you are and what you believe in, because you can't take it for granted, right? And as part of that, there's this sense of moral responsibility to make sure that Jewish concerns are heard and addressed.
So, okay, so you started to do research. Did you go to any of the Jewish powers on campus, any of the Jewish organizations to help you? Did you tell them about it? Was your campaign also directed at them?
Sure. So I tried to be as strategic as possible, as a 22-year-old kid is. First of all, I wanted to learn how the money was given. And so I was told by a faculty member, you need to obtain the terms of agreement. I had no idea what this was, but I was able to go to the development office and ask specifically for the terms of agreement between the university and the donor, Sheikh Zayed bin Sultan Al Nahyan, the president at the time of the United Arab Emirates, to understand who gave the money. That was the first piece.
They gave it to you?
They gave it to me.
Mistake.
Big mistake. And I was completely honest in my asking. I told them I was doing research. I absolutely played up my genuine Southern roots so that I would win them over. But they gave me the material. And why it mattered was because there were two very problematic causes in the terms of agreement that raised a red flag. The first related to there being an exchange of academics between Harvard University and between this think tank, which was the major think tank of the Arab League, the Zayed Center. Well, that only benefits the Zayed Center because the individuals associated with the Zayed Center were promoting anti-Americanism and anti-Semitism. The second red flag was that depending upon who was hired, what professor was hired to sit in this named chair, the Zayed chair, was then only after that was approved by the donor would the remaining $2.5 million be given. That's a huge no-no in terms of how transactions take place because it means the donor has say. So this was a problem.
So who in the Jewish world did you turn to?
Sure.
Apart from your activist friends?
Yep. So first I went to the most established faculty members who I thought in the Jewish community at Harvard who would be able to help me. And many of them were very understanding. However, they would whisper very quietly after they closed the door to their office and say, what are you going to do about this? This is really important. And they themselves were actually concerned about engaging in it. I then went to Hillel.
Why were they concerned? What could happen to them? They had tenure.
They did have tenure. Those who had tenure said, we don't want to be the quote-unquote APAC professor on campus. Those who had tenure said, we are going to feel very uncomfortable at departmental meetings. Those who had tenure said things like, We may not be published at certain publishing houses or not be asked to speak at particular conferences.
So social concerns, career concerns,
Absolutely.
political concerns.
And those who didn't have tenure wouldn't touch it with a 10-foot pole, right, because they knew that it could pose a problem to get tenure. I then went to Hillel, which is just one of the natural places a Jewish student would turn. And what I found at Hillel was that they said, look, we understand this is of concern, but we actually don't deal with confrontational issues.
Hillel said that.
Hillel said this. And it didn't matter which Hillel rabbi.
So a source in the Gulf with billions of dollars was kind of injecting anti-Semitism in many ways into America's most preeminent university. You found out, and you found out the details. And nobody in the Jewish world, in the established Jewish world, was going to help you. How did that make you feel?
Well, I have to tell you, as a student who's a transplant to Boston, right, I felt like I didn't have that quote-unquote grown-up support that a student needs in order to deal with a very challenging issue. The response from some of the organized Jewish communal professionals in the Boston area said, why don't we get Alan Dershowitz to speak? And with all due respect to Alan, who's amazing, that is not what I needed to solve this problem. And so within their Rolodex of ideas, they didn't know strategically how to deal with this, where to start. They were concerned about any kind of ramifications. And I think I felt a little frustrated, definitely disillusioned. And also I felt like, well, if you guys can't do it, then who is expected to do it? And I refused to let the answer be nobody.
And so you did it. And at the end of the day, Harvard caved.
They did.
Why?
Well, it actually wasn't Harvard caving first. First, it was the Zayed Center saying that they were going to shut down, that this major think tank of the Arab League was going to close, and that they found it more important to have an association with Harvard rather than this problematic entity. So Harvard didn't respond first. The Zayed Center responded first. Mm-hmm. Harvard then said, you know what, we're going to hold on to the money and we're going to do research on our own and we'll get back to you in a year. That was their decision.
Get back to you.
Correct.
In a year.
And I decided to share the information with anyone and everyone who would listen, even though I had already graduated, because I wanted Harvard to return the funds and seek reputable funding to create a position in Islamic studies.
And what made Harvard, at the end of the day, what was Harvard's decision?
So Harvard's decision a year later was to return the funds completely. They gave all of the money back, the $2.5 million. They said that they were going to create a chair in Islamic studies, but it would come from a different source. And Harvard decided not to have Zayed associated with its institution.
Okay. So this was a battle. And I would have to say, as a person who's been in these battles, it was the first victory, I think, that the Jewish people have had on campus. And it rang a bell. After graduation, what did you do?
So after graduation, I opened the New York office for the David Project, which at that time was really the only kind of startup organization who was willing to work with Jewish students on campus and students who incurred hostility for supporting Israel, Jewish or non-Jewish. Mm-hmm. And I opened their New York office. And when I opened their New York office, I began meeting with students on campuses in the New York area. Columbia, NYU, community colleges, you name it. And when I met with students at Columbia University, they said, here's our problem. We love Columbia. And it's very easy to be Jewish at Columbia, actually. But the issue for us is that there are faculty members who use the classroom as a bully pulpit to really create hostility toward any student who supports Israel publicly. And they said, so we need your help having people become more aware about that issue.
Again, they're in Columbia University, in New York City,
yep,
capital of American Jews, right? They had to come to somebody who worked for an agency in Boston, the David Project was in Boston, to get help. Had they tried to get help at Columbia University when these things happened to them?
They had already. Many of these students had talked to professors privately. similar kind of scenario that I was in, and the professors did not want to get involved. They were often told to just keep doing their schoolwork and to not be bothered by these issues. And they also went to Hillel. And when they went to Hillel, same kind of thing. It's easy to be Jewish here. It's comfortable if you wear a kippah or wear a Star of David. And the students said, we know, that's not our issue.
So somehow somebody in this conversation decided to make a film because they thought that by making a film and broadcasting it across the country, it would ring an alarm bell for what was happening to Jewish kids, even in Jewish New York. And your role in the film was what?
So it was actually one of the students, and she was a film major. And so she said, what we want to do is raise awareness about what's happening, and one way to do that is to create this sort of pseudo-documentary in which students have an opportunity to share their experiences on film about what's happening in the classroom, and then it can be shown to those who are serious stakeholders at Columbia, whether it's Board of Trustees, invested alumni, faculty members, Jewish communal professionals. And we said as the David Project, great, let us help you do it. So we worked with the students to find the students, corroborate their experiences because we wanted to make sure this is what actually happened, and provide the support for them to be able to create that film.
Okay, so now we're going to take a look at a clip from this film called Columbia Unbecoming to give our audience a taste of what Jewish students were experiencing at Columbia University.
Intimidation and harassment of Jewish students by professors was documented over a decade ago.
Columbia University, Ivy League education, world-class professors, and now charges of academic intimidation. A new documentary, Columbia Unbecoming, charges professors from the Middle Eastern Studies Department harass students who express pro-Israel views.
Professors are using their power as professors to push their views on students and harass them to stop them from airing their opinions.
And he looked right into my eyes and he said, "See, you have green eyes." He said, "You're not a Semite." He said, "I'm a Semite. I have brown eyes." He said, "You have no claim to the land of Israel."
Basically, I raised my hand. I said, "Hello, my name is Tommy. I'm Israeli, and I would like to ask you some questions." And before I could continue, he stopped me and said, "Oh, are you Israeli? You served in the IDF?" I said, "Yes." So his next question was, "How many Palestinians have you killed?"
At Northeastern University, a student felt bullied by a professor when she questioned his praise for Hamas in class.
I just felt very ostracized in the class by the professor. I cited reasons as indisputable as the U.S. considers them a terrorist organization. He wanted me to rewrite my paper because he did not see how I could logically have come to that conclusion. I am still entitled to that opinion, and he shouldn't have to force his views upon me.
We just want honesty. We want to feel comfortable expressing views in the classroom that might not be the views that the professors themselves hold. We just want to make a safe and good educational environment.
So the filmmaker is Avi Goldwasser, who went on, this was his first, to make many, many films about the Jewish situation in this new time. What was it like to hear that? How did the Jewish community respond to that, and how did Columbia University respond?
The Jewish community had a mixed response. The Jewish community, in some ways, felt very concerned about what was happening about Columbia, but didn't know what to do about it because they were shocked that Columbia University could be treating Jewish students in this manner, and non-Jewish students, if they supported Israel. Many of the Jewish professional leadership in the New York area did not want this film to be shown, and were very frustrated and angered that an outside organization worked with these students directly to address their concerns, and felt that the David Project, the students, were blowing things out of proportion. And in terms of, I think,
You know, blowing out of proportion.
Yeah.
If one thing happened to a black kid or a Latino kid or a woman on campus, the whole world is going to know about it. Classes are going to be shut down. People are going to be getting sensitivity trainings
That's right.
about this. But in this case, it was the Jewish professionals, you're saying, who said, "Sha."
yeah.
Yeah.
You know, we joked because we were doing a lot of research, and the research was with students at Columbia, but also research from faculty members. And I have pages and pages of notes of faculty telling me about their concerns as faculty members, none of whom were willing to go on the video.
Right.
None of them were willing to even have their faces blurred or their voices masked. And we joked that what we should actually name the film was Moranos of Morningside Heights, right? Because there was such a sense of fear,
Right.
which was unbelievable in the 21st century. Now, what did Columbia do?
They didn't come from Johnson City,
That's
Tennessee.
right. That's
the
exactly
problem,
right. That's exactly right. Now, Columbia was highly problematic in terms of responding. I mean, I remember sitting in the provost's office at the time and showing him this film and watching his body language as he slunk deeper and deeper into his chair.
Right.
So he knew there was an issue. However, they set up this ridiculously casted committee to look into it, many of whom who had been involved in the BDS movement. And it was a sham. They wanted the students to come and speak about what was happening to them in the classroom to individuals who already had a very clear anti-Israel agenda. And the students actually, many of them refused to do it. They refused to play the game.
Okay. Now let's cut to the current situation on campus, because this was 10 years ago
Right.
or more. And situation has changed. So could you give us a thumbnail sketch of how you see the game, the situation on campus for Jewish students?
Yeah. So it is important to note that the situation has changed, and I would argue the way it has changed the most is that you have a lot of organizations within the Jewish community that now focus particularly on the students, right? Mm-hmm. They want the students to have the support they need, so you have a lot more organizational support. That was very different from previously. That being said, there's very little support for faculty still. That has not happened in a serious way. And I would argue that even though it is 10 plus years later, the systemic structural issues that allowed this to happen, to create hostility towards those who support Israel on campus, has not fundamentally been dealt with.
Okay. So what is Rachel Fish's prescription for the Jewish community? If you had to say it in a paragraph, what does the Jewish community have to do now that it hasn't done before?
I think the Jewish community has to recognize that there are intellectual factors that have created hostility not only towards Israel but towards Western civilization that have to be deconstructed. And until you actually invest in deconstructing these ideas, it's very hard to transform a university environment because it's predicated on the idea of ideas.
So you're saying that anti-Israelism is a derivative of this thing we call postmodernism or political correct ideas. Israel is just one more bad white guy in this new story.
Exactly.
And until the intellectuals who have failed thus far to deconstruct that aim at that, we're going to have a continuing problem.
Yes. And I would add one other piece to this, which is that it's the responsibility of the university administration to recognize that Jewish students ought to be viewed as a minority and not part of the white majority. Because what happens around the Israel conversation specifically is that it's viewed as political discussions. And so people hide behind academic freedom and say whatever they want. However, there really is hostility that's masked as political discussions, but it's deeply rooted in anti-Semitism.
Okay. Rachel, these are prescient prescriptions for the Jewish community. Let us hope and pray that your words at least reach at least some of our leaders and that you continue to inspire Jewish students and us who are their defenders across the country. And you young lady, warrior, Jewish heroine, Dean Slayer, Rachel Fish, may you go from strength to strength. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm Charles Jacobs. See you next time on Paradigm Shift, here on JBS.